Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you guys are at. Hope you have a fantastic day. It's SoulSaint here, and we're at the home stretch. We're on the final head that we needed to talk about today, which is the Head of Suffering. The Head of Suffering, actually, amongst like the later portion of some of these heads, are a little bit more on the easier side to deal with. Now, there is something you do have to be concerned about, right? In terms of what the Head of Suffering brings to the table for the other heads, but more specifically, what one particular debuff that he does can be kind of a little bit of an obnoxious experience if you're not careful, right? So, let's get started with it. The Head of Suffering has Crippling Jaws, which is like his default ability. He attacks all enemies, placing a 25% weaken debuff for 2 turns. This debuff cannot be resisted. Something to keep in mind. He will not place weaken debuffs on enemies with strengthened buffs, though, so keep that in mind, right? Decapitation effect. What happens to him whenever we do get the chance to kill him, right? He does place a shield buff on all enemy champions for 2 turns equal to 30% of their max HP whenever he is killed. So, it's kind of a blessing for us. We get an extra little bit of shielding, right? So that means that we can take a little bit more damage, we can survive a little bit longer, you know, go the distance. Drawback to that, though, if you're not careful, is that there's another head that likes to take buffs and spread them to his team, so you might have to be a little careful with how you manage this, but in general, mostly a good W for you, you know what I mean? So I would look at that as like a value for you for the most part, right? Thirst for Pain. Places an ally protection buff on all heads except for this one for 2 turns. He does place a 30% reflect damage buff on himself, though, for 2 turns, which is something you have to watch out for. And then he also places a provoke debuff for 1 turn on the enemy with the highest crit damage. So your damage dealer is going to be the one that gets provoked, right? Now, why is this a problem? Well, one, typically the Head of Suffering isn't as much of an issue. However, you know, adding ally protection means that the amount of damage that we're doing to heads that do have that buff on them means that he's soaking up some of that for us. So, like, if we're trying to, you know, one of the more aggressive heads that we need to address more consistently would be like Decay or maybe Mischief, you know, the 2 of the most annoying ones. Having to deal with those both at the same time, while having a little bit more survivability from ally protection is no bueno. We don't want that, right? In addition to that, having him have reflect damage and provoking our highest damage dealer with the one that's typically going to have the highest crit damage means that whenever we are attacking or that damage dealer, if he's not cleansed or if he's not protected in some capacity, when he goes to take on the you know, to do his damage, he's going to do his default ability. Like you use your Chrissy who does enemy max HP hit, she's practically going to kill herself, you know what I mean? Or Razovark, for example, someone who is squishy already in nature but does a lot of damage. He's going to go and try to do his A1, he's going to triple hit, he's going to triple hit himself to death, right? We don't want that to happen. Now, that's not all that he does, though. He has one other thing, and this is the thing I think is the most concerning in terms of like what we have to watch out for, which is Share Suffering. It's kind of in tandem with the fact that his name is Suffering, but Share Suffering is basically he attacks one enemy and he places a pain link. It literally looks like a mirror. It's a red debuff that looks like a mirror, and I kid you not, it's literally whenever he takes damage, you're going to take a portion of that too as well, right? So it's basically kind of like a tether to whoever has that debuff where whenever he takes damage, whether that's through the ally protection that he put on his enemy team or, you know, on the other heads, right? Or if you just join direct damage to him, it's going to spread a little bit. And that could kind of hurt, right? Especially if your team is like pretty aggressive in the damage output that they put, right? So it's kind of a problem. The last little bit, and this is just more something to take in consideration. You can do this in prep before you go into fighting the boss. You could just add this extra little bit in mind to your scenario of requirements, right? Is Almighty Suffering, his passive. His passive gives an increase to resistance, a total of 50 to every single head. As long as he exists, they have higher resistance, which means that if you barely hit the minimum threshold for accuracy to land that provoke on the head of Decay, for example, well, now you're more likely to fail now because of that extra little bit in mind. So, how do you combat that? You basically just build a little more accuracy. That's basically the long short of it. Or you use somebody like Razovark who gives increased accuracy, so you're even more over. You got that little buffer to take care of in the event that that resistance was a factor at one point, right? So you kind of get rid of that by just basically building better, for lack of better words, right? And as you go up in higher difficulties, you need to have a little bit more in those stats, and that's something just to keep into consideration, right? Like the other heads, he also has the decreased damage of all Hydra. All Hydra heads take from AoE damage by not 10% this time, but 30%. So he's kind of like your guardian tank for all the heads, right? And that's kind of a little bit of an obnoxious experience to have. So, you know, if you're primarily like pretty heavy in the AoE department, you don't want this guy to stick around because, well, he's neutralizing some of your damage by a pretty hefty amount, right? You know, 30% ain't nothing to scoff at this point in time. I mean, 10% isn't either, but more importantly, 30%. That's 3 times as much, you know what I'm saying? You know, quick math. He also does decrease damage taken from poisons, yet again being another area where the debuff is starting to become less valuable by 90%. So you're only getting 10% of that original poison, which is pretty it's pretty disheartening if you're relying on that, right? So poisoners are starting to lose a little value in the Hydra side of things, right? Damage from skills that scale off of enemy max HP, you know, HP burn or War Master procs or Giant Slayer procs do not exceed their restricted numbers. So it's the same like other heads, you know, 50% for War Master, you know, 20% for HP burn, and then you cap at 10% for enemy max HP, right? And then, of course, he's also immune to hard CC, so like stuns, freezes, provokes, particularly for this guy, is a little bit of an issue. So, you know, in terms of like how you would approach him, you can't really just straight up control him, you know, no turn meter reduction, no HP swapping, none of that stuff works there. So how do we deal with this guy? Well, the saying kind of goes with the way that we've dealt with other heads. Like, we talked about how, you know, Blight puts a Poison Cloud and how Mischief spreads buffs if he's able to take them, right? Well, the same is true also for someone that likes to put buffs on themselves, right? So block buffs being a very, very good value here. So you kind of already ignore that reflect damage because it never works, right? The same thing is also true for ally protection to the enemies. You put that block buff, even when he tries to put it on them, it's not going to land because they're denied, right? So very, very good value of being able to remove this. Now, we still have to deal with the fact that he provokes. We still have to deal with the fact that he also does Pain Link, so those are two debuffs we have to watch out for, and the fact that he does Weaken, right? But we can manage Weaken by having Strengthen. We can also manage Weaken by Cleansing, and other areas of control that, like, or not control, but like of mitigation that will enable us, right? So how do we deal with this, right? We talked about beforehand, and I'm going to kind of go to a different one. I keep trying to avoid using someone like Duchess as an example, but she would work, right? I'm going to use Pythion this time for the point of conversation here. He cleanses and removing all debuffs, but he also puts a block debuff on. So if you already have this in play, whenever he tries to put that provoke out, it's not going to land, right? The same thing is also true for like Weaken. However, remember, it can't be resisted. Now, cleansing being the point of the conversation here, we talked about a champion that everybody can acquire that is game changing, and that's Mithrala, right? Not only does she cleanse debuffs, so like that Pain Link goes away, but she also puts Strengthen in play too. So in the event he tries to put that Weaken's not going to work, right? So there's value there from someone like her where she's multifaceted. She's very valuable at being able to address multiple heads mechanics in one, right? And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for you know, champions that can facilitate multiple roles very, very well. And that kind of shows you a little bit of like how you can kind of manage that. In addition to that, one other way you can kind of address this is that, like, although I'm not going to recommend this ideally because I don't really see as much value in this debuff, and I'll explain why. Decreased resistance could help, right? When you're dealing with that passive that gives everybody resistance. So by lowering the resistance, even with the increased resistance, it's easier for you to land those debuffs, right? However, it takes accuracy to land those unless it says, you know, this debuff cannot be resisted or ignored. And there are some champions that do that, don't get me wrong. But it's not going to be commonplace, right? I think they're better suited for other areas of the game or maybe not suited at all for this type of content. At which point, I would just take in a baseline of wherever they are at in their stat values. If you're doing normal, you know they have a certain stat range, right? And just add that extra 50 into play, right? Like, how can we expect to deal damage or deal debuffs to a champion that has their base stat plus that 50? And then you look at that and you're like, all right, I'm going to prepare with this number in mind instead of their base value, right? So I would look at it that way. And then in addition to that too as well, we have to be careful with that Pain Link. So cleansers like how we talked about before with Pythion, preventative measures with like Duchess, for example, right? I'm also going to give an unorthodox one I think is really, really, really cool. So Pain Link and those debuffs that we're talking about removing, White Dryania could actually do that with her A2, right? Removing all debuffs and even giving a cooldown reset, right? Healing, all that great stuff. But on top of that, too, she provides Strengthen and Weakness, a lesser version, a weaker version of Strengthen, but that with ally protection. So now, whenever he tries to apply those debuffs that we were talking about earlier, that could be kind of problematic, right? We're able to mitigate it by having it already in play, right? So that's good value in terms of like champions that are doing it. They're doing a little bit of everything, right? I'll go ahead and explain another additional aspect behind like maybe White Dryania being a little underrated. She has an enemy, she hits all enemies that puts a decreased speed. Now, it's at a lesser rate. I believe it's at 50 when it's fully booked. So yeah, we got 30%, 45, 50. Yeah, so 50% there that we can actually add. It's a flip of the coin, but it is still a chance, and that means that you'll be able to speed up ahead of them and do damage to not only Suffering, but all the other heads for that matter, right? Cleansing and removing that Pain Link will also enable your champion to do a little bit more because now they got their cooldowns reset by 2 turns, right? And then protecting them, you know, keeping them alive. If you're partnering this with a champion that likes to heal a lot, maybe that that Tuhana rack that we were talking about that also cleanses, or that Doom Priest. Now, instead, she also gives extra healing to the rest of the team too as well. And believe it or not, if you see your entire team kind of fatigued, I have used this as an example where White Dryania just targets herself, puts her A2 on her. Yes, she's getting the cooldown again from it, or whatever the case may be. Well, no, she can't be the one that's targeted, because then it wouldn't reduce it. But then she could just boost heal everybody. I think that'll be the better value, right? That's why it's important to read. But in general, that in tandem with her passive, she'll just basically splash damage. Instead of damage, it'll be splash healing for your team, and that's just really, really good for like a pick-me-up if you ever see yourself kind of low. As a matter of fact, I'm actually going to try to see if I can utilize her a little bit more in some of my competitions in the future to see if maybe she can enable, disable, or, you know, provide that little bit of utility we're looking for from a utility standpoint. That might be another valuable champion that can give you some extra relief in terms of what Suffering brings to the table. But at the end of it all, it's cleansing, prevent, and then of course, you know, preventing the boss from having those type of buffs that would make it a little bit harder for you to manage through the block buff range. Of course, decreased attack is always going to be good, so you take less damage in general. All those same mechanics. You kind of see how there's like synergy behind like a lot of the same type of champions are starting to. If you find throughout any of these type of heads or throughout the series that we have done so far, you find like champions that I keep mentioning over and over again that do kind of the same thing. The Ugos, the Mishinakis, the Duchesses, for example. Those champions, they stand out to you because, like, you know what? I have someone that does that. You may seem that they are going to be a little bit more commonplace, and they're going to really shine in this type of environment, because once you start finding those champions that can kind of overlap in all these different mechanics do well, that it just enables your Razzlebark or whoever you decide to put in maybe your Chrissy, if you're that that lucky to have her. You're going to let them just cook and let them go in and just send it and really slam into the enemy, and that ultimately results into you getting that top chest that you're looking for, whether that's hard knight chest, or if you're looking at nightmare, grandmaster chest. You're looking to get that top reward at the end of the day, make it worth your while, right? So, with all that being said, I hope this series has helped you in any capacity. I will do one more video that's going to talk about compositions. I did ask members of the community to provide me references, or their experiences of champions that they went through using in terms of compositions, and we're going to do a breakdown on each of these listings, or at least go through a couple of them in my community tab. If you're looking for, if you go to my YouTube channel here and you look under the community tab, and you see that there's going to be a section where I have asked some of these questions, such as what was the composition that worked best for you when it came to tackling Hydra, right? And we got a lot of responses already. There's a lot of people who are giving different ways to how they approach utilizing certain champions, and we'll take a look at it. We'll take a look at some that are maybe a little bit more for beginners, maybe something a little bit more advanced, maybe something a little bit more whaley. We'll talk about it. We'll break down why I think this is going to be a good contribution to players, or maybe I would consider an alternative measure, like maybe if you so happen to have this champion. We'll do a breakdown of that, and then of course at the end of it all, it's just to help us all grow and be a little bit more efficient at being able to tackle one of the more, at first, frustrating contents of the game to deal with, but later down the road, one of the more fun ones, especially once your champion pool really opens up, right? With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Like, comment, subscribe if you haven't already done so. We're almost at 500 subscribers. As of the time of this recording, we're less than 8 away, less than 7 maybe at this point. Feel free to go ahead and contribute to that if you haven't. If you're first time here, please feel free to ask questions. If you found something that you're like, you know what, this worked for me, maybe somebody else can benefit from this, please. I'll love to respond to it, and I'll look into it. We'll see it. Maybe we'll showcase it ourselves. Who knows? With that being said, always, guys, always remember, stay ascended. Take care.